Welcome to the game line. In 1871, the very first international rugby match was played between England and Scotland in front of 4,000 roaring spectators. Scotland were the victors and won the match 1-0. 153 years later, this rivalry still remains strong as we saw yet another great Scottish performance to claim the Calcutta Cup. We'll be looking at how England got such a dominant start in the first 20 minutes through a strong kicking game and defensive pressure. Then, we'll look at how Scotland managed to come back with a very strong lead to close out the match. The main reasons for this early dominance from England was their great contests in the air, good set pieces and aggressive defence. With their kicking game, they were very clinical and accurate when they sent it high. These kicks were medium range from Ford and Kerr, and their chases did phenomenally to disrupt Scotland's back three. In order to understand this aerial dominance, we also need to look at England's attack. England played with a lot of width in this game, which really stretched the Scottish defence and put strain on their outside defenders. These wider attacks, which were spearheaded effectively by their back row, really destabilised Scotland's pendulum by drawing their defenders into the defensive line. Essentially, in a pendulum, a team's wingers will move up out of the backfield to cover the attack if the defensive line is threatened. The fullback and opposite winger will then move into these spaces to cover any kicks that might come their way. But England's distribution was superb in this period, and they moved the ball side to side very effectively. This forced Kinghorn to also cover the defensive line, leaving one backfield defender by himself. In these situations, you would usually send another backline player to support the backfield, typically either the 10 or the 9. I don't know what Scotland's defensive system is in these situations and who was responsible for plugging the backfield, but they didn't react quickly enough and it left their defenders isolated. And as I mentioned, England's kicking was highly accurate, which meant that there were always going to be disruptions. England's set pieces were also really good in this period. Both their scrum and their lineout gave their strike runners excellent platforms to attack, which would then lead into these dominant kicking situations. In general, throughout the match, England had the more dominant set piece. While the scrum was closer than what the win percentage shows, as Scotland did manage to get some penalties here, overall, England just had the better platforms to strike throughout the match. This first English try is an example of just this. Scotland and England set up for a scrum on Scotland's 22. Scotland then get a free kick against them for not keeping the scrum stable, and the English pack back themselves by calling another scrum. It's a solid scrum from both, but Scotland looked to be getting the slight upper hand. Ben Earl does well to pick up the ball before the ref can make a decision and runs towards Finn Russell's inside shoulder. At the same time, Ollie Lawrence runs an exceptional dummy line, which draws Russell and creates an uncertain Scottish defence. He offloads to Danny Kerr, who draws Tuipulotu. Slade then bumps into Tuipulotu and knocks him over, which forces Hugh Jones to choose between Ford and Elliot Daly. At this point, Scotland is in a strong drift defence, and they don't have enough speed to prevent Daly from slicing through the line. Daly then gives a simple offload to Furbank, who goes in for a well-worked try. Lastly, let's look at how this English defensive system managed to disrupt Scotland's attack so effectively. While I do think there is a focus on their outside backs and how they can make mistakes in the system, I don't think enough praise is being given to the players shooting up in the midfield. This English defence uses a lot of aggression and line speed to snuff out their opponent's attack before it can get momentum. In this game in particular, they really targeted Finn Russell and the first part in the middle. This was a really effective strategy, especially if we look at the stats. In their previous two matches, Scotland managed to make 145 passes against France and 140 against Wales. Against England, they only made 98, despite having similar amounts of possession. This just shows how brutally effective England managed to shut down Scotland's general attack and distribution. I thought Ben Earl and Mara Itoje in particular put great pressure on Scotland's receivers. So how did Scotland come back to take the match? There are a few reasons for this, but I think a big one is that they were very clinical with their chances. Although I thought that England's defence was solid, I did think that they did succumb to some of the negative effects of a rush defensive system. Namely, that it requires teams to be very well drilled and experienced using the system, otherwise gaps can form. If we look at the first Duan van der Merwe try, we can see this inexperience in action. Scotland have a scrum just behind England's 10-metre line. Scotland then uses Tuipulotu as the first receiver, with Jones on the outside and Russell wrapping around. Hugh Jones then breaks the line who, after being tackled by Freeman and Furbank, offloads to Van der Merwe, who scores the try. At first glance, it might seem like Henry Slade is to blame here, as he is the one that shoots out of the line. But on closer inspection, we can see that it was actually Lawrence's job to cover Jones, as George Ford is covering Tuipulotu on the inside. Even though Henry Slade is doing everything right and rushing strongly, the fact that Ollie Lawrence tackled the wrong man left a big gap that led to a relatively simple try. When we look at the match stats overall, it doesn't really seem like Scotland dominated as much as the scoreboard would suggest at that time. Scotland's finishing was really good in this game, and even though England did genuinely disrupt big parts of their game, they still showed that they can get points with minimal room to manoeuvre. Another reason was that I think Scotland's game management was very solid. They were patient and selective about when they would attack or keep the game tight and territorial, particularly in the second half. Scotland did still try to play with speed and width like we are used to seeing, as is evident by those first 10 or so minutes of the match. But when they saw that it wasn't working and that England's defence was solid, they switched to a more conservative attack and kicking approach, which put pressure back on England. By the end of the match, Scotland made 34 kicks to England's 31. They also had a kick-to-pass ratio of 1 to 2.9, while England were at 1 to 4.8. These, among other stats, such as territory, suggest that despite England's pressure throughout the match, Scotland were able to deal with it effectively. I also felt that Scotland's back three grew into the game as the match went on. England's kicking game was still effective during the second half, but they didn't create nearly as many opportunities as in the first. They also showed variation in their attacking structure, especially as they moved closer to England's try line. Their pods became very tight, with the hopes of sucking in more defenders and exposing the outside of the field where England's defence was most vulnerable. The last point that I'd like to make about Scotland's dominance is that England really were their own worst enemies. I'm not saying that England definitely would have won this game if they hadn't made so many mistakes. Credit must be given to Scotland for the class that they showed. But the English really did shoot themselves in the foot many times. It feels like there is a solid platform for England hiding just below the surface. They just need to unlock it by being a bit more accurate. They have a wealth of talent that could be used to great effect, but it's been a very long time since someone was able to utilize it consistently. The oldest rivalry in World Rugby remains a strong one, even if Scotland have dominated it recently. How long do you think it will be before England retake the Calcutta Cup?